He offered her money to forget the pregnancy, but she chose love and disappeared. 5 years later, the billionaire CEO sees her again, this time with twin boys who look exactly like him. Ethan Hall had built his empire on precision, control, and the unshakable belief that everything had a price. From the corner office on the top floor of a steel and glass tower, he looked out over the city like a man surveying his kingdom. At 32, he was already a legend in the business world, a self-made millionaire whose blonde hair and striking blue eyes had become as recognizable as his name in the pages of glossy magazines. Yet beneath the admiration and envy, Ethan remained convinced that love, trust, and all the fragile emotions ordinary people clung to were nothing more than distractions. Money could buy loyalty, power could demand respect, and success could silence pain. Or so he told himself. When Sophia Wilson had entered his life, she had been a disruption to that careful order. Dark-haired, soft-spoken, with blue eyes that carried warmth instead of ice, she had disarmed him in ways he did not expect. She was not impressed by his wealth or by the circles he moved in, she had wanted him for who he was beneath the armor he wore. For a time, he had allowed himself to believe he could love her, though in truth he had never let go of his obsession with control. That fragile illusion shattered the night she came to him with trembling hands and a voice that quivered between fear and hope. She told him she was pregnant. The words should have awakened something tender in him, should have pulled him closer. Instead, Ethan's mind spun immediately to risk, image, the headlines that could threaten his reputation, the chaos a child could bring to the meticulously ordered life he had built. Panic hardened into coldness as he looked at her. He didn't shout or curse, he simply reached for the one solution he had always trusted. From the drawer of his desk, he pulled out his checkbook and placed it on the table between them, his blue eyes void of emotion. "You'll be taken care of," he said with a voice so calm it felt like cruelty. "Whatever you need, whatever it costs, I'll cover it. You won't want for anything." To him, it was generosity, to her, it was betrayal in its purest form. Sophia's heart splintered in that moment. She had come hoping for reassurance, for the warmth of his arms, for the promise that love would anchor them both in the storm of uncertainty. Instead, he had reduced her life and the life growing inside her to a transaction, a problem to be solved with money. Tears welled in her eyes, not of weakness but of clarity. She saw the man before her as he truly was, brilliant, powerful, but empty in all the ways that mattered. Her voice was quiet but firm when she answered. "I don't want your money, Ethan. I wanted your love. And if you can't give me that, then you've already lost us." She pushed the checkbook back toward him, her hands steady despite the breaking inside her chest. He did not stop her when she walked away. His pride would not allow it. His arrogance whispered that she would return, that no one ever walked away from Ethan Hall. But she did not return. She vanished from his world that night, her silhouette dissolving into the city streets while he remained in his office, staring at the untouched checkbook on his desk. For days he told himself he had done the right thing, that he had avoided weakness, that success required sacrifice. But somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of denial, a voice whispered that he had lost something irreplaceable. He silenced it with work, with endless meetings, with late nights spent expanding an empire that felt suddenly hollow. What Ethan did not know, what his pride would not let him consider, was that Sophia was leaving not only him but also the life he had chosen. She carried within her the future he had rejected, 2 children who would never know their father's embrace, 2 lives born of love he had been too afraid to claim. And while Ethan continued building his fortune, believing control made him untouchable, the decision he had made that night would haunt him in ways he could not yet imagine. Sophia's world collapsed the night she walked out of Ethan's office, but she refused to let it destroy her. She was carrying not just her own future but the future of the 2 small lives growing inside her, and that knowledge forced her to find strength she never believed she had. The city that had once felt so bright now seemed cruel and indifferent, but she learned to navigate it with a quiet determination that hardened with every passing day. She found herself working long hours at a small diner at first, scrubbing dishes and wiping counters until her hands ached, saving every dollar she could. The nights were the hardest, when she returned to her tiny rented apartment, curled up alone, and felt the twins stir within her. In those moments she whispered promises to them, promises that they would never be unwanted, that they would never feel the sting of rejection the way she had. When the twins were born, Sophia thought the pain of labor would consume her, but as soon as she held them in her arms, the fear dissolved into something overwhelming and unshakable. Alex and Daniel were perfect, two tiny boys with wisps of blonde hair and wide blue eyes that pierced her with both joy and sorrow. They were the mirror of their father, the man she had loved and lost, and for a moment the sight of them nearly broke her heart all over again. But then they cried, and their fragile fists reached out for her, and she knew that they were hers in a way Ethan could never take away. Whatever mistakes she had made, whatever wounds she carried, she had been given a second chance at love through them. The early years were brutal. Sophia worked 2 jobs, one cleaning offices at night and another at a hotel reception desk during the day. She barely slept, often running on sheer willpower and coffee, but she refused to falter. Every time she thought she could not endure another shift, she reminded herself of the 2 little faces waiting for her at home. She learned how to stretch every dollar, how to cook cheap meals, how to sew torn clothes instead of buying new ones. Yet for all the exhaustion, there were moments of such piercing happiness that she knew it was worth it. Watching Alex take his first steps across the living room carpet, hearing Daniel's laugh fill the air like a melody, seeing them curled up against each other as they slept, those moments made the sacrifices bearable. Still, there were nights when Sophia would look at her sons and feel the ache of the past. Their eyes were Ethan's, clear blue and sharp, and sometimes it felt as though he were staring back at her through them. She wondered what it would have been like if he had chosen differently, if he had held her that night instead of pushing her away with money. She wondered if he would have loved these boys, if he would have been proud of them. But each time those thoughts crept in, she forced herself to push them aside. She could not afford to dwell on a man who had abandoned her. Dwelling on him was a luxury she no longer had. All that mattered was giving her children a life that was stable, safe, and filled with love. As the years passed, Sophia began to regain a sense of balance. At the hotel where she worked, her dedication was noticed, and she was given more responsibility. She learned to manage her time with precision, waking before dawn to prepare breakfast, rushing through her shifts, and returning in the evenings with enough energy left to sit on the floor and play with toy cars or read bedtime stories. Though her life was far from glamorous, it had purpose, and she clung to that purpose fiercely. There were times when loneliness clawed at her. She had friends, kind colleagues, and the occasional neighbor who offered to babysit, but there was no one to share the weight of her burdens with, no one to lean on when she felt like collapsing. And yet, when she looked at Alex and Daniel, she found her strength renewed. They were her anchor, her light in the darkness. She often told herself that perhaps this was the life she was meant to have, a life of quiet struggle, but one where she was surrounded by the kind of love Ethan had been too blind to value. What Sophia did not know was that time had a way of unearthing the past. Though she had worked so hard to bury every memory of Ethan, the resemblance of her sons to their father made it impossible to forget entirely. Every laugh, every smile, every piercing look from their blue eyes reminded her that her story with him was not as finished as she wanted it to be. And deep within her heart, though she would never admit it, she feared the day when fate might force her to confront the man she had once loved and the father her children had never known. 5 years passed in what felt like both a blink and an eternity for Sophia. The days blended into one another, a steady rhythm of work, sacrifice, and moments of fragile joy that only her children could bring. Alex and Daniel were now 4 years old, energetic and inseparable, always running hand in hand, finishing each other's sentences as though they shared not only blood but a single spirit. Their laughter filled the small apartment where Sophia had created a home for them, a place that may not have been filled with riches but overflowed with warmth. She had built a life that was stable, if exhausting, and in many ways she believed she had succeeded. The boys never went hungry, they were never without love, and they never felt the absence of their father, at least not yet. Her work at the hotel had become more than just a job, it was her second home, a place where she could rely on a paycheck and a measure of respect. She had proven herself reliable, professional, and resilient, qualities that her manager valued. Guests often remarked on her calm demeanor, her ability to handle difficult situations with grace, and her quiet smile that seemed to reassure even the most demanding travelers. But beneath that exterior was a woman who had long since given up on her own dreams. She did not think about romance, about what it might feel like to be held by someone who saw her as more than just a hardworking single mother. All of that had been buried the night Ethan offered her money instead of love, and she had locked those hopes away as tightly as possible. The boys grew quickly, and with each passing year their resemblance to their father deepened. Strangers often commented on their striking blue eyes, eyes so vivid and piercing that they seemed almost too intense for children. Sophia forced herself to smile in those moments, but inside it was like a reminder carved into her soul. She could never fully escape Ethan's presence, even though she had not seen him in years. Sometimes, late at night, she would watch her son sleep and wonder whether he ever thought of her, whether he ever regretted the choice he had made. She hated herself for asking those questions, because the answers could not change the reality she lived with every day. Despite the hardships, Sophia began to believe that perhaps fate would allow her a quiet life. She did not need grandeur or wealth, she only needed the sound of her sons' voices and the small joys of ordinary days. She imagined them starting school, learning to read, and running home to tell her about their adventures. The world she had built was modest, but it was hers, and she clung to it fiercely. Then, one evening that began like any other, fate struck. The hotel lobby was bustling with guests arriving for a corporate event, and Sophia was behind the reception desk, focused on checking people in with her usual efficiency. Her sons were with a trusted babysitter, and she was thinking about what story to read them before bed. She barely noticed the tall figure entering the lobby until her gaze lifted instinctively, and her breath caught in her throat. Ethan Hall stood there. He looked almost unchanged and yet entirely different. His blonde hair was still neatly styled, his tailored suit cut to perfection, his blue eyes scanning the room with the confidence of a man who owned not just the building but the city itself. But there was something in his face now, something sharper, as though the years had etched lines of restlessness and weariness into his features. For a moment Sophia thought she must be imagining him, a ghost conjured by her own exhaustion. But when his gaze found hers, steady and unflinching, she knew he was real. Her first instinct was to look away, to retreat, but her body froze. She could not move, not when the man who had once broken her was standing just a few feet away. He, too, seemed caught, his expression faltering as though the air had been knocked out of him. And then his eyes shifted past her to the glass doors, where two small boys had just entered, running to greet their mother with shouts of joy. They had been brought by the babysitter, eager to see her for a brief goodnight kiss before heading home. The moment Ethan's gaze landed on Alex and Daniel, the entire room seemed to fall away. He stared at them as though the earth itself had split open, revealing a truth he had never prepared himself to face. Two boys, identical in their golden hair and startling blue eyes, stood beside Sophia. They looked up at her with adoration, and then, curiously, at him. The resemblance was undeniable, so stark that even strangers in the lobby turned their heads, whispering. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to shield the boys, to turn them away, to gather them close and disappear before Ethan could fully register what he was seeing. But it was too late. His expression told her that recognition had struck him like lightning, searing and irreversible. For the first time since she had known him, the powerful and untouchable Ethan Hall looked utterly undone. Ethan's world tilted the moment his eyes met the boys'. For years he had lived with the certainty that his choices were final, that his past with Sophia was buried beneath the weight of success and the unrelenting forward march of ambition. Yet now, standing in the middle of the hotel lobby with the glow of chandeliers gleaming above and the murmur of businessmen and tourists swirling around him, all of that certainty dissolved in an instant. Two pairs of blue eyes, so unmistakably his, stared back at him with the innocent curiosity of children who did not yet understand what kind of storm was building in the space between adults. Sophia felt her heart thunder against her ribs as she drew the boys close, their small hands gripping her arms, their faces lit up with the pure joy of seeing their mother. She wanted to whisk them away before Ethan had a chance to speak, before he could use that commanding presence to break into the fragile life she had built. Yet she could not move, her body caught in the invisible tension of his gaze. Memories came rushing back, the night he had offered her money instead of love, the way his cold voice had severed everything between them, the months of carrying her children alone, telling herself she had to be strong. And now here he was, staring not at her but at them, as though he were seeing his reflection multiplied and brought to life. The room had fallen into an uneasy hush. Guests who moments earlier had been engrossed in conversation now exchanged glances, their eyes darting between Ethan, Sophia, and the boys. Some whispered under their breath, sensing drama without context, while others pretended to look away, though curiosity tugged at them. Ethan hardly noticed. His steps carried him forward almost against his will, each movement slow, deliberate, as though he feared that if he moved too quickly, the vision before him might shatter. Sophia straightened, her voice a whisper of steel when she finally spoke. "Don't," she said firmly, her body shifting protectively in front of her children. "Stay where you are." Her tone was quiet, but the authority in it froze him mid-step. He stopped, his chest heaving as though he had run miles to reach her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his eyes searching hers with desperation, with questions, with guilt. Then his gaze slid back to the boys, and his lips parted as if to form words, but no sound came. Alex tilted his head, curiosity sparking in his young face. He tugged lightly at his mother's sleeve and whispered in the unguarded innocence only a child could carry, "Mama, who is that man? Why does he look at us like that?" Daniel mirrored his brother's glance, his blue eyes wide and cautious, but neither child sensed the magnitude of the moment. To them, he was only a stranger. To Ethan, they were the living embodiment of everything he had lost. He finally found his voice, though it was rough, unsteady, stripped of the commanding authority it usually carried. "Sophia," he began, and the single word carried both recognition and regret. He swallowed hard, his throat tight as he tried again. "Are they?" He couldn't finish the question, couldn't bring himself to say the words that were already written across their faces. Sophia's spine stiffened. Her hand smoothed down Alex's hair, her arm wrapped around Daniel's shoulder, every part of her posture radiating protection. Her reply was quiet but sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence. "They are mine. Mine alone." The words rang out not as a denial but as a warning, and Ethan flinched as though struck. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The hum of the hotel returned in fragments, the clink of glasses, the roll of suitcases across marble floors, the distant sound of an elevator dinging, but to Ethan and Sophia, the world had narrowed to a single, unbearable truth. He saw himself in the curve of the boys' jaws, in the shape of their shoulders, in the startling clarity of their eyes. He knew without question that they were his sons. And Sophia, meeting his gaze with unwavering strength, knew that he understood it too. The weight of realization crushed Ethan's chest, guilt surging like a tide too strong to hold back. He wanted to speak, to explain, to beg, but words seemed meaningless compared to the 5 years he had not been there, 5 years of first steps, first words, scraped knees, and quiet nights he had forfeited. He had imagined that his success had made him untouchable, but here, before 2 small boys who carried his blood, he had never felt so powerless. Sophia gathered her strength, pulling her children gently toward the exit. She would not let him see her tremble, would not let him claim ground in the world she had built without him. As she walked away, Ethan's gaze followed, burning with a mixture of desperation and dawning shame. For the first time in his life, the man who had believed everything could be bought understood that there were things beyond his reach, things he had thrown away with his own hands, and that no amount of power could easily restore. That night Ethan did not return to his penthouse with the usual satisfaction of closing a deal or the comfort of being in control. Instead, he lay awake in a bed that suddenly felt too large, staring at the ceiling while the image of two little boys with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes replayed endlessly in his mind. He could not escape the truth that stared back at him in their faces. He had seen his own reflection, multiplied and softened by youth, and it had shaken him to the core. For years he had convinced himself that walking away from Sophia had been the right choice, that money was enough to solve what he deemed a mistake, but the weight of that lie now pressed on his chest so heavily he could hardly breathe. His thoughts spiraled back to the night she had told him about the pregnancy. He remembered the fear that had twisted into anger, the pride that had blinded him, the cruel certainty that love was weakness. He had watched her leave, telling himself she would come back when she realized she needed him. But she hadn't. Instead, she had built a life on her own, raising 2 children without his help, without his presence, without his name. And now those children were old enough to walk, to laugh, to speak, to ask questions, and he had not been there for any of it. The realization struck him with an almost physical pain. The following days only deepened his torment. He attended meetings, nodded through presentations, signed contracts, but his mind was elsewhere. Every face he saw reminded him of theirs. Every child he passed on the street made his chest tighten with the thought of what he had missed. He imagined Alex and Daniel's first steps, their first words, their birthdays, moments that had belonged to Sophia alone, moments he could never recover. For the first time in his life, money felt utterly useless, a hollow currency that could not buy back time or erase regret. Unable to bear the silence of his conscience, Ethan sought out Sophia. He waited outside the hotel after her shift, approached her in the lobby when she passed, tried to catch her when she was alone. Each time his voice faltered, stripped of its usual authority, replaced with desperation. He begged for a chance, for even a moment with the boys. "Please, Sophia," he said one evening, his words rough with exhaustion. "Let me see them. Let me explain. I know I don't deserve it, but I can't ignore this anymore." Her reaction was not anger, but something far more piercing, calm, controlled, and impenetrable. She looked at him with those deep blue eyes, the same eyes she had passed down to her sons, and shook her head. "You offered me money when I asked for love," she said, her voice low but firm, each word cutting with precision. "You turned your back on me when I needed you most. I won't let you do the same to them. They don't deserve to be broken by you the way I was." The words left him gutted. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, on never letting anyone see weakness, but standing before Sophia, stripped of excuses, he felt exposed. He realized she was right. His absence had not just hurt her, it had defined the lives of his children. They had grown up without a father because he had chosen pride over responsibility. That truth was unbearable, and yet it was one he could not deny. At night he wrestled with his guilt, pacing through the halls of his penthouse as though the silence mocked him. He thought of his own father, a man of stern principles who had taught him that strength meant never showing vulnerability, never bending to emotion. For so long Ethan had believed that creed, had shaped his life around it, but now it seemed like a prison he had locked himself into. Sophia had begged him for love, and he had mistaken her plea for weakness. The irony was cruel. In trying to protect his empire, he had lost the one thing that could have given it meaning. The more he thought of Alex and Daniel, the more the emptiness inside him grew. He wanted to hear them laugh, to hold them when they cried, to be there when they needed someone to guide them. He wanted to be their father, not just in name but in truth. And yet he knew that desire alone would never erase the past. If he wanted even a chance at redemption, he would have to prove himself in ways that went beyond words, beyond money, beyond power. He would have to show Sophia, and the children, that he was no longer the man who had let them go. As the nights bled into days, Ethan's resolve hardened. He had built an empire from nothing, surely he could rebuild a family he had once destroyed. But deep in his chest lingered a fear he could not silence. What if it was too late? What if Sophia's trust was gone forever, and the boys would never accept a father who had chosen absence over love? The thought haunted him, yet it was not enough to stop him. For the first time in his life, Ethan Hall was not chasing profit or power, he was chasing the chance to repair the one thing he could never buy back, his family. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on an afternoon when Sophia brought the boys to the hotel lobby after her shift. She had no intention of letting them linger, but Alex spotted Ethan before she could steer them away. The boy's curious nature had always made him fearless, and with an innocent smile he broke free from his mother's hand and walked toward the tall man in the tailored suit. Ethan froze, his pulse hammering as the child looked up at him with wide, unguarded eyes. There was no suspicion in that gaze, only a puzzled fascination that disarmed him more than any accusation could. After a long pause, Alex tilted his head and spoke with a matter-of-fact certainty that left Ethan breathless. "You have eyes like mine." The world seemed to stop in that moment. Sophia's heart clenched as she hurried forward to pull Alex back, but the words had already been spoken, and they reverberated through Ethan like a bell tolling in a vast, empty chamber. He crouched slowly, lowering himself so he was at eye level with the boy, his usual arrogance stripped away. He did not know how to speak to a child, had no practiced charm to rely on, but something raw and instinctive guided him. His voice was low, almost reverent, when he replied. "Yes. I do." Sophia wanted to intervene, to sever the fragile thread forming between them, but she could not bring herself to do it. Daniel had joined his brother now, standing close with cautious eyes, and the sight of the two boys together, looking at Ethan as though searching for a connection, left her shaken. She had spent years preparing to shield them from him, but in this instant she realized that the choice might not be entirely hers. Children had a way of seeing truth with a clarity adults lost. And whether she wanted it or not, the truth was written plainly across all three of their faces. From that day forward, the boys asked questions. They were not demanding, but their curiosity was persistent. Who was the man in the lobby? Why did he have the same eyes as them? Why did he look so sad when he saw them? Sophia tried to deflect, to explain away the encounter with half-answers, but children sensed hesitation as easily as they sensed affection. Eventually she allowed Ethan to see them again, under her watchful eye, because she realized that forbidding it entirely would only raise more questions she could not answer. Ethan approached cautiously, as though every moment might be snatched from him. He came without the shield of his wealth, without gifts or grand gestures, only with the tentative humility of a man trying to reclaim what he had lost. He stumbled through simple things at first. Reading aloud from children's books felt foreign to him, he mispronounced words, his voice uneven, but the boys laughed and corrected him with the authority only children possessed. When they wanted to play ball in the park, he found himself awkward and clumsy, unable to keep up with their boundless energy. Yet they laughed harder when he failed, and in their laughter he discovered a joy he had never known in boardrooms or high-rise towers. Sophia watched all of it with wary eyes. She expected him to falter, to give up when it became inconvenient or when his pride took a blow, but to her surprise, he kept showing up. Day after day he returned, not as the polished CEO who commanded respect from the world, but as a man fumbling to learn how to braid shoelaces, how to patch scraped knees, how to listen when a child explained the intricate rules of a game invented on the spot. Slowly, her sons grew accustomed to his presence. Daniel, the more cautious twin, took longer to open up, but eventually even he leaned against Ethan's side while watching cartoons, as if testing the strength of the bond that was forming. For Ethan, each of these small moments was a revelation. He had missed so much, years that could never be returned, but the simple weight of a child's head resting on his shoulder was worth more than every contract he had ever signed. At night he still wrestled with guilt, but now there was also hope, fragile, trembling, but undeniable. He began to believe that perhaps redemption was not beyond him, that perhaps the love of his children could stitch together the broken pieces of his past. Sophia, however, remained cautious. She could not forget the man he had been, the pain he had caused, the coldness with which he had once dismissed her. Yet as she stood at the threshold of the living room one evening, watching Ethan struggle to balance both boys on his lap while reading a picture book upside down, she felt something shift inside her. He was no longer the untouchable millionaire who had once chosen pride over love. He was a man learning, failing, and trying again, and against her will she began to see the sincerity in his effort. It terrified her to hope, but part of her wondered if change was truly possible, and whether the man she had once loved was buried somewhere beneath the layers of arrogance and fear. By the time the boys fell asleep that night, curled together on the couch with their heads against Ethan's chest, Sophia realized that the walls she had built around her heart were not impenetrable after all. She reminded herself that she was not ready to forgive, not yet, but as she pulled a blanket over her sons and saw Ethan look at them with tears silently welling in his eyes, she could no longer deny the truth. The man who had once turned his back was now fighting for a place in their lives, and slowly, impossibly, he was beginning to earn it. Sophia had never intended to give Ethan the chance to step back into her life, yet weeks of his persistence and the boys' growing attachment made it impossible to ignore him any longer. She told herself she was only allowing this for Alex and Daniel, that they deserved to know their father in some form, even if she never trusted him again. But as the days unfolded, she began to notice the quiet transformation in him, a change so profound it unsettled her. He no longer carried himself with the same rigid pride that had once defined him. Instead, there was a humility in his movements, an uncertainty in his voice, and a willingness to put aside control when it came to their children. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, Sophia found herself sitting across from Ethan at the small kitchen table in her apartment. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but he was the first to break the silence. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his usually confident blue eyes shadowed with something she had rarely seen in him, fear. His voice was low, stripped of all its commanding edge. He admitted that he had been a coward, that when she told him she was pregnant all those years ago, he had panicked and chosen money because it was the only language he understood. He told her he had convinced himself he was protecting his empire, protecting the image of strength he had worked so hard to build, but in truth he had only been protecting his own pride. He confessed that not a day went by now when he didn't regret it, when he didn't think about the years he had lost with his sons. Sophia listened, her arms folded, her heart torn between anger and pity. She remembered vividly the cold look in his eyes that night, the way he had slid the checkbook across the desk as if she and her children were nothing more than an inconvenience. His apology, no matter how raw, could not erase that memory. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but edged with bitterness. She told him that his absence had not just wounded her but had forced her to carry a burden no woman should have to face alone. She spoke of the nights she had worked until dawn and still come home to care for 2 infants. She described the moments when she had felt so weak that she thought she would collapse, but she had kept going because she had no choice. She reminded him that while he had been building his empire, she had been building 2 lives without a father. Her words struck him like blows, but he did not turn away. Instead, he let them wash over him, his jaw tightening with each sentence. When she finished, silence filled the room again, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he raised his eyes to hers, and there was no trace of defense, only desperation. He told her he could not undo the past, and he did not expect forgiveness for himself. But he begged her not to punish the boys by keeping him away. He said they deserved to know their father, not the man he had been, but the man he was trying to become. He promised that he would not walk away again, no matter how hard it became, no matter how much she doubted him. Sophia's heart ached as she looked at him. She wanted to believe his words, but belief was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. She had spent years learning not to depend on anyone, especially him. Yet she could not ignore the way Alex and Daniel's eyes lit up when Ethan entered the room, or the way they laughed more freely when he was near. They had already begun to love him, and she knew she could not take that away from them. Still, she warned him that one mistake, one sign of weakness, and she would not hesitate to close the door forever. She told him plainly that she could not bear to see her children broken by the same man who had broken her. Ethan nodded, his expression solemn. He told her he understood, that he would spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy of them. For the first time since she had known him, she saw a man stripped of all the armor he had built around himself. There was no arrogance left, no indifference, only a fragile sincerity that unsettled her because it was real. That night, after he left, Sophia stood by the window, looking down at the city lights that stretched endlessly below. She thought about the years of solitude, about the battles she had fought alone, and about the man who had once abandoned her now returning with empty hands, asking for a chance to be part of what she had built. She did not know if she could forgive him, but for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that forgiveness was not only about him, it was also about freeing herself from the weight of the past. And though she would not admit it even to herself, a small part of her wondered if the story she thought had ended long ago was only now beginning again, written not in pride and betrayal, but in the slow, painful language of redemption. Spring arrived quietly, carrying with it the promise of change. The city shook off the cold, and with it Sophia found herself loosening the grip she had held on her heart for so long. Weeks of Ethan's steady presence had begun to create a rhythm in their lives, a rhythm she had never dared to imagine before. The boys now asked about him every morning, their voices filled with excitement, their eyes shining with anticipation. They spoke of him as if he had always been there, weaving him naturally into their games, their stories, their dreams. Sophia watched this unfold with both fear and wonder, realizing that despite all her efforts to shield them, Alex and Daniel had already let their father into their hearts. It was during one such evening, when the air was warm and the scent of blooming flowers drifted through the small garden behind her building, that something irrevocable shifted. Sophia had taken the boys outside to chase fireflies, their giggles echoing against the stone walls, while Ethan sat nearby, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, watching them with a tenderness she had never seen in him before. He didn't speak much, didn't try to impress her with grand words or gestures. He simply watched, as if the sight of his sons running freely beneath the twilight sky was the most valuable treasure he could ever possess. When Alex tripped and scraped his knee, Sophia moved instinctively, but Ethan was already there. He knelt in the grass, lifting the boy gently, brushing away the dirt with surprising patience. His voice was calm and reassuring as he comforted him, pressing a kiss to his forehead before carrying him back to the garden bench. The sight rooted itself in Sophia's chest. She had imagined 1,000 times that he would fail, that he would grow impatient or indifferent, but what she saw instead was a man discovering the simple, selfless joy of fatherhood. It was not the Ethan she had once known, but someone transformed, shaped by regret and determination. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep inside with fireflies still glowing in a jar beside their bed, Sophia stepped into the quiet garden again. She found Ethan still sitting there, staring at the stars with a contemplative expression. For a moment she simply stood in the doorway, watching him, remembering the man who had once been untouchable, who had looked at her pregnancy as an inconvenience, who had believed money could silence love. This man looked nothing like that. His shoulders were no longer squared with arrogance but heavy with humility, his eyes no longer cold but softened by the weight of what he had almost lost forever. She walked toward him slowly, the gravel crunching beneath her feet, and he looked up, startled by her presence. There was silence between them, the kind of silence that carried more than words could. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. She told him she did not know if she could ever erase the pain of the past, did not know if forgiveness was something that could be offered so easily, but she had seen enough to believe that change was possible. She admitted she had been afraid to hope, afraid to let him back into their lives, but watching him with their sons had shown her something undeniable: he was trying, and not for himself, but for them. Ethan listened without interruption, his jaw tight, his eyes damp with unshed tears. When she finished, he leaned forward, his voice breaking as he promised once more that he would never abandon them again. He told her he had lived in a gilded prison for years, surrounded by everything money could buy but starved of the only thing that mattered. He said the boys were his second chance, and she was his anchor, the one person who had ever seen through the facade to the man underneath. He asked for nothing more than the chance to keep proving himself, one day at a time. Sophia's heart ached as she heard the sincerity in his voice. She had spent years building walls to protect herself, but those walls had already begun to crumble, not because of words but because of actions. She thought of the way the boys lit up around him, of the softness in his eyes when he looked at them, of the quiet evenings when he helped with bedtime stories without complaint. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and placed her hand over his. It was not a gesture of complete forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. For a long time they sat together beneath the stars, their hands joined, the silence between them finally peaceful rather than suffocating. Sophia realized then that the story she thought had ended years ago had transformed into something new. It was not the same love she had once offered him so freely, untested and fragile. This was a love scarred by betrayal, hardened by time, and reshaped into something stronger. Inside the apartment, Alex and Daniel stirred in their sleep, their small bodies pressed together beneath a blanket, their breaths even and steady. They would wake to a world subtly changed, a world where their father was no longer just a stranger but a presence they could trust, and their mother no longer carried the weight of raising them alone. As Sophia leaned against Ethan's shoulder, she allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time in years. The pain of the past would never vanish, but it no longer had to define them. In its place grew something fragile yet resilient, a new beginning forged out of regret, resilience, and the unshakable bond of family. And as the night deepened around them, Sophia realized that perhaps the most shocking twist of all was not his return, but the fact that after everything, her heart was willing to believe again.